Montana Territory, April 1882. The sky cracked in two with thunder as Georgia O'Malley stood alone in the rain, her boots sinking into the muddy road just west of Helena. Her dress, once cream-colored cotton, clung soaked and dark to her frame. Behind her, the carriage that had carried her from her family's ranch rolled away without a second glance. Her father's words still echoed, sharp as the lightning arcing overhead. "You are no longer welcome under my roof." All she had done was refuse to marry the banker's son. That was her sin. That and being foolish enough to believe her family would love her anyway. She turned in place, arms wrapped tight around herself, and tried to figure where to go. She had no money, no friends in town, only the weight of shame and the echo of the door slamming behind her. A sharp whistle cut through the storm. She squinted down the road and saw a lone rider coming up the trail, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the rain. His horse was a mottled gray with a limp in its back leg. The man slid from the saddle with easy grace, his boots splashing in the mud. "You all right, miss?" he asked, voice low and steady. Georgia blinked up at him, shaking from more than the cold. "Does it look like I am?" He took one long look at her soaked dress, her bleeding palm, the way her shoulders trembled, and nodded once. "No, ma'am, it surely does not." She wanted to be proud, wanted to say she would be fine. But her lips quivered and she found herself pressing a hand to her mouth instead, trying to hold in the sob. The man's eyes softened. "Name's Boone Nash. I have a cabin about 5 miles yonder. You can dry off, eat something warm, no strings." "Just shelter." Georgia stared at him, searching his face for mockery or pity. There was none, only quiet concern. He offered his canteen. She drank. That was how it started. The cabin sat nestled in a thicket of pine trees where the wind sounded like the ocean. Boone's place was rough-hewn but clean. A fire snapped in the hearth. Blankets were folded neatly. He brought her a dry shirt and trousers, telling her, "They will be big, but dry beets soaked." He turned his back while she changed, then handed her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of venison stew. Her hands shook around the cup. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice hoarse. Boone leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on the other knee. "Because someone should." Georgia stared into the fire. She had never been treated like that before, not by a man, not by anyone. Boone gave her space the way someone might with a skittish colt. He did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. He just made sure the fire stayed lit, the stew stayed hot, and that she knew where the extra blanket was if she got cold in the night. She barely slept. The next morning came gray and cold. Boone was chopping wood outside when she stepped onto the porch. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His arms were strong, but it was the quiet rhythm of his movement that struck her. Like he had been living out here a long time, like he knew how to be alone and not lose himself in it. "Can I help?" she asked. He paused, axe halfway raised. "You ever split wood before?" "No," he nodded once. "Then now is a fine time to learn." She did not have much strength in her arms, but he guided her hands, showed her how to hold the handle, how to aim for the grain. When she finally split a log clean, he gave her a rare smile. "Well done, Georgia." Her chest tightened at the sound of her name in his mouth. He let her help with the chores that day, feeding the chickens, hauling water from the creek, mending a tear in the fence. By dusk, she was sore and exhausted in a way that felt good. That evening, over beans and cornbread, she finally told him everything. Her family, the engagement she had refused, the backhanded slap from her father, her mother's silence. Boone did not interrupt or pity her. He just listened, jaw tight, eyes dark with anger he never voiced. When she finished, she asked, "Do you think I was wrong?" "No," he said simply. "I think you had more courage than most." Her throat burned with unshed tears. Days passed, then a week. Georgia stayed, working beside him, learning to ride his old mare, helping cook and clean and fix the broken hinge on the barn door. Boone never touched her without reason, but when he looked at her, it was steady. Warm. She began to laugh again. Not often, but real and surprised, like it had been buried and was clawing its way out. One night, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, she sat beside him on the porch. Her hair brushed his arm when she leaned forward to rest her elbows on her knees. "I do not know what comes next," she said. Boone looked out over the field. "You do not have to, not yet," she turned to him. "I do not have a name anymore, not really. My father made sure of that." He turned to meet her gaze. "Then take mine," her breath caught. "I mean it," he said. "If you want it, I will marry you, not out of pity. Because I want to, because you belong somewhere, and I want that somewhere to be here, with me." Georgia's hands trembled in her lap. "You do not even know me." "I know enough. I know you are brave, I know you are kind. And I know I feel more at peace with you under this roof than I have in 10 years out here alone." She looked at him, really looked, and then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "I want to be yours." Boone reached out and took her hand, calloused fingers warm around hers. "You already are." The wind carried the scent of thawing pine and damp soil as May settled in. The last of the snow had melted into the earth, leaving behind a land waking slow from winter. Boone had planted beans and turnip in the small garden patch he kept near the west fence, and Georgia had taken to feeding the hens before sunrise. Her skirt still dusted with dew by the time he came in from checking the traps. She'd begun to hum under her breath while she worked. Not songs from home, those had soured, but tunes she made up as she went, soft and shapeless like creek water finding its way around stone. That morning, she tied her hair back with a strip of old muslin and met Boone by the barn with a question lingering behind her eyes. "Do you know what day it is?" He wiped his hands on his trousers, puzzled. "Not exactly. I keep time more by the season than the calendar." "It's been a month," she said, then gave a small nod as if confirming it for herself. "Since I came here." His brow furrowed slightly. "Feels shorter. Feels longer to me," she said. "Like I've known this place a long while." She looked toward the ridge where the trees grew dense and dark, then back to him. "I was thinking, I'd like to learn how to shoot, if you're willing." Boone nodded once, no hesitation. "We'll start with the rifle. Easier to balance. Safer, too." They walked out past the creek, where the cottonwoods leaned in close and the ground dipped into a sort of hollow. Boone set up a row of pine cones on a fallen log, then stepped back and handed her the rifle, his voice quiet but certain as he explained the parts, the weight of it, how to brace her shoulder. Her hands weren't steady. The first shot missed wide. The second, too. But she never flinched, and she didn't ask to stop. By the fifth shot, the cone toppled clean. Boone gave a small nod. "You're teachable." She smiled, not broadly, but enough to show the corners of her lips could still lift. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked, not looking at him. He watched the smoke drift from the rifle's barrel before answering. "No, not once. Not even for something better. There isn't better, just different, and most of it costs too much." She lowered the gun and let it rest across her arms. "You think I cost too much?" His gaze held hers. "You're not something to be weighed like that." They walked back in silence. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she didn't mention it. That night, she laid the muslin strip on the table and used a needle to stitch tiny white flowers into it, her fingers slow but steady. Boone carved a new handle for the drawknife, his thumb moving careful over the grain. As the fire burned low, Georgia glanced toward him. "Before I came here, I never did anything with my hands. I read books, sat in parlors. Learned how to smile politely even when I wanted to scream." Boone didn't look up. "What changed?" "I did, or maybe I just remembered something I'd forgotten." He set the handle down. "You want to go to town tomorrow. There's a man there keeps a little store, dry goods, cloth, maybe even thread for your sewing. I've no money. You've me." She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "All right." The next morning they took the wagon, Boone guiding the old mare while Georgia sat beside him, her hair tied back neatly, her dress pressed as well as she could manage. The road into Helena was still rutted from the melt, but the trees had opened up and patches of wildflowers blinked from the edges. In town, no one looked twice at them. Boone left her to browse the store while he spoke with a man about a new scythe blade. Georgia ran her fingers over the bolts of fabric, not needing anything but letting herself want for once linen the color of sand, a tin of buttons shaped like stars. She didn't take much. Just a needle case, a spool of blue thread, and a tin comb she could use to set her hair properly. Boone paid without blinking. As they stepped outside, she paused on the porch, watching a pair of children chase each other through the dust and noise. "You ever think about having a family?" she asked quietly. Boone adjusted the sack under his arm. "I think about what's possible. Not what's missing." She turned to face him, and if it were possible, he took a step closer. "Then I'd want it with you." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "Then I think I'd want that too." They rode home under a sky streaked with thin cloud and late light. Boone reached over once and laid his hand over hers. She didn't pull away, didn't speak. Just let her fingers curve around his palm and held on. Georgia stood on the step of the cabin porch, holding the tin comb in her hand. The morning was warm enough to where her sleeves rolled, and the sun had just cleared the treetops, casting a pale gold over the grass that had finally turned green again. Boone was in the pasture, coaxing the fence post straighter with a mallet and a length of wire. She watched him a while, not for the first time noticing how quietly he moved, how he never rushed through his work, not even when the ground was soft enough to swallow his boots whole. She stepped down, soft tread over packed dirt, and called out, "Do you think we could fence in a bit more land?" Boone set the mallet down and straightened, wiping his brow with the edge of his shirt. "For what?" "I'd like to keep a milk cow, maybe plant strawberries along the edge." "If you think it's worth the effort." His gaze lingered on her a beat longer than usual before he answered. "If you want it, we'll manage it." They walked the line of the current fence, measuring with their strides. She pointed to a bend near the creek. "That spot gets good light. And the ground's rich there." Boone nodded, then glanced toward the barn. "We'll need better shelter if you're serious about a cow. That roof won't hold another winter." "I can help with the frame," she said quickly. "I've seen it done. I can hold the beams steady if nothing else." He didn't argue, just picked up the coil of wire and walked with her back toward the yard. They stopped beside the porch, where she bent to pull a weed from the earth near the step. "I never thought I'd care about planting anything," she said. "But I've been dreaming about it. Putting something in the ground and watching it take hold." Boone's voice came quiet. "You already have." She looked up, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then she stood and reached for his hand, sliding her fingers into his without asking. That evening, Boone brought out a small tin box from inside the chest near the hearth. He set it on the table between them, then sat down across from her. "My mother gave me this before I left Kentucky," he said. Said it was the only thing she had left from her mother. "I've kept it locked away too long." Georgia opened the lid and found a pair of silver earrings, tarnished but whole, shaped like leaves. She turned one over in her palm. "They're beautiful. They're yours now if you want them." She didn't answer right away. Just reached across the table and touched his wrist, her thumb tracing the line of a scar she hadn't noticed before. "What happened here?" "Rifle misfire. Years ago." She ran her fingers gently over the mark. "You don't talk much about the past. No use in it, mostly." "I'd still like to know." "If you're willing." He leaned back, thoughtful. "I left home at 17. My father drank too much, beat his horses, beat my brother. I took off one night with nothing but a saddle and a borrowed rifle, never looked back." "You never wanted to?" "No, not until now." She looked up sharply. "Why now?" "Because you make it feel like there's something worth remembering again." They sat in the quiet for some time, the fire burning low. She rose finally and stepped behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "I want to marry you proper," she said, "not just in name. I want it to be real." Boone turned in his chair to look at her. "It already is, but if you want a preacher, we'll find one. I want to stand beside you and have it known. I want to build something here with you that can't be taken away." He stood, and she reached for his hand again. He didn't nod, he didn't smile, he just held her hand tighter. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," he said. "We'll make it official." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hymn too old to name. Georgia laid her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath his shirt, and thought for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she belonged. The preacher's house sat just outside Helena's southern edge, a squat building with a low roof and a porch shaded by cottonwoods. Boone tied the mare to the post while Georgia stepped carefully around a patch of wet earth, lifting her hem to keep it clean. She wore a dress she'd sewn from a bolt of sage-colored cotton she'd chosen herself, the sleeves plain, the waist fitted close. She hadn't added lace or trim, there hadn't been time, but her needlework along the cuffs was fine and even, and her hair was pinned in a way that made her look taller. Boone offered his arm as they crossed the yard together, and she took it without hesitation. Inside, Reverend Holcomb stood from a small desk, brushing biscuit crumbs from his vest. He was a thin man with a nose like a peacock's and eyes that looked as though they'd seen too many winters. "You're Boone Nash," he said, nodding, then turned to Georgia. "And you're here to be Mrs. Nash." She held herself steady under the words. "Yes, sir." Holcomb's wife, a quiet woman with a soft voice and a crooked shoulder, brought out a worn Bible and asked them to stand near the hearth. There were no flowers, no music, just the smell of dry wood and the sound of wind against the shutters. "Do you come here of your own will?" the Reverend asked. Boone's voice didn't waver. "I do." Georgia looked at him, the lines of his face steady and unguarded. "I do," she said. Holcomb spoke the rest quickly, without flourish. There were no rings, just joined hands and the echo of the words settling into the stillness. When it was done, Georgia looked down at their clasped fingers. Boone's thumb tightened just slightly over hers. That was all. On the ride back, the sky was pale and wide, and the air smelled of birch and fresh grass. Georgia held her new husband's hand as the wagon bumped across uneven ground. "I never pictured it like that," she said. "Like what?" "Quiet, honest. No one watching to see if I got it wrong." Boone glanced over. "You didn't." The cabin came into view, its roof catching the last bit of afternoon light. Boone slowed the mare, bringing them to a stop just shy of the porch. Georgia climbed down first, her boots hitting the ground soft. She walked to the front door, then turned. "Will you carry me over the threshold?" Boone paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Is that something you want?" "It's something I never thought I'd get," she said. He crossed the distance without a word, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a breath. Her arms went around his neck, not tightly, just enough to feel the strength beneath his shirt. Inside, the cabin was clean and warm. The fire had kept low through the day, and the scent of preserved apples lingered near the stove. Boone set her down gently, then stepped back. She reached for his hand again, resting her palm against his chest. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just a life, a home, one that holds." "You will," he said. "No, we will." Her voice dropped. "But I'll need to know more about you, about who you were before all this. If I'm to carry your name, I want to understand what it carries." Boone didn't shift under her gaze. "I've made mistakes," he said. "I've let things rot when I should have mended them. I've gone silent when I should have fought." "Did you ever leave someone behind?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But not anymore." She didn't ask for details. She only nodded and reached up to unfasten one of her pins, letting her hair fall loose around her shoulders. Later, as the light dimmed and the wind picked up against the walls, Boone brought her a small box from beneath the floorboard, something he'd buried there years ago, when he'd first built the cabin. Inside were a few letters, yellowed and folded, and a photograph of two boys sitting on the edge of a riverbank. "My brother's gone now," he said. "Died in '78, fever took him fast." Georgia traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb. "He looks like you." "He was louder," Boone said. "Funnier, but he never did learn to keep still." She handed the picture back carefully, then stood and crossed to the fire. "We can hang it here." "So he's not forgotten." Boone didn't speak, but he followed, and together they placed the photograph on the mantel. The flickering light caught the curve of the boy's grin, and Georgia felt something inside her settle. "We'll need new curtains," she said after a while. "And I'd like to plant lavender along the windows." Boone leaned against the hearth, arms crossed. We'll need better hinges on the door first. That wind's going to tear it off its pins by next winter. Then we'll fix it together, and they would, not all at once, not easily. But with hands willing and hearts steady, they would. By late June, the land had shifted into the full weight of summer. The mornings brought a thin haze of heat, and by midday, the air hung close and still. Georgia had started rising earlier, just after Boone left to check the line near the ridge, using the quiet to work on sewing a white muslin cover for the bed frame he'd built from pine and iron nails. She moved slowly in the heat, one palm pressed to her back now and then to ease the ache that had come on sometime in the last week. Boone noticed, though she hadn't said a word. "You've been walking different," he said one evening, leaning against the doorframe as she shelled peas into a bowl. "I'm fine," she answered, not pausing in her work. He crossed to her and took the bowl, setting it aside. "You're favoring your left side. Is it your hip?" She shook her head, then hesitated. "Not exactly." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I think I'm carrying." Boone didn't speak right away. His eyes held hers, and then his hand came to rest lightly over her stomach. "You're sure?" "I know my own body," she said softly. He nodded once and stepped closer, folding her into his arms with a gentleness that surprised her. His cheek pressed to her hair. "All right," he said. "Then we prepare." The next morning, he hitched the wagon and rode to the neighboring homestead, where a couple named the Holts lived with 3 children and a milk cow. When he returned, he carried with him a sack of oats, a small cradle carved from aspen wood, and a bundle of cloth diapers tied with twine. "They said we can have the cradle," he told her. "Their youngest is walking now." Georgia ran her hand along the smooth edge of the wood, her throat tight. "It's more than I expected." Boone set a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do any of this alone." That evening, she sat out by the fence while Boone worked on reinforcing the barn roof. The sky was streaked orange and violet, and the chickens had already gone still. She felt the baby as a faint stir in her belly, like the flutter of cotton caught in wind. When Boone came to sit beside her, she didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly, "I used to think I wasn't meant for this." "For what?" "For being happy. For being wanted." "You were wrong," Boone said. "So was I." They sat until the stars came out, their hands joined between them, resting on her lap. In August, Boone rode to Helena again, this time to speak with the midwife, Mrs. Eliza Danner, who agreed to come stay the month of the birth. She arrived with a carpetbag full of herbs and a voice like gravel softened with honey. "You've got good color," she told Georgia, running a careful hand along her wrist. "Strong lungs, too. You'll do fine." Georgia, who had never once been told she was strong in body, nodded slowly. "I believe I will." The weeks passed quiet. Boone built a rocking chair from spare timber. Georgia embroidered a tiny shirt with her initials and the date sewn in blue thread. The nights grew cooler and Boone began storing firewood again. When the leaves started to yellow, they hung cloth over the windows to keep out the draft. In early October, during a cold snap that browned the tops of the last green shoots, Georgia went into labor. It lasted through the night. Boone stayed just outside the room, his jaw tight, hands raw from wringing. He didn't sleep, didn't sit. By dawn, he heard the cry he'd been waiting for. Mrs. Danner stepped into the doorway, her eyes bright with fatigue. "She's strong," she said. "And so is your daughter." Boone crossed the threshold and found Georgia pale but smiling, the baby wrapped in a wool blanket nestled against her chest. He sank to his knees beside the bed. "Her name is Clara," Georgia said. "It means bright." Like the morning. Boone leaned forward and kissed Georgia's temple. "She's perfect." That winter, the snow came early, blanketing the land in silence. Boone stayed close to the cabin, tending to Clara while Georgia rested, chopping wood in smaller lengths so she could feed the fire without strain. Clara had his steady eyes and Georgia's mouth, and when she slept, she curled one hand near her face the way Georgia did when she dreamed. By spring, Georgia had planted the strawberries she'd spoken of, the small green shoots pushing up through fresh, turned earth. Boone built a fence around the plot, not because she asked, but because he knew how much it mattered to her. One evening, as Clara napped in the cradle by the hearth, Georgia stood in the doorway, watching Boone carve a wooden spoon. "You ever want to leave this place?" she asked. He looked up. "Not once." "Neither do I," she said. They stood in silence, her hand sliding into his. The air smelled of pine smoke and thawing ground. The light shifted slowly across the floor, and the only sound was the soft breath of their daughter, asleep and safe. They never left. Not because they couldn't, but because there was nothing beyond that could offer more than what they'd built. A home with walls they'd lifted together. A child born of quiet love. Two people who had once been broken, learning, piece by piece, that they were whole. And through each season, through the threshing sun and the brittle frost, they remained. Together, rooted, unshakable as the hills that held them.